Greetings. My name is Mike, and I love my kids more than anything in the world. I would do anything for them without hesitation. Yes, I know that's what all parents say, and words are cheap, but I believe it to my core. Not many men get the chance to prove that statement. I was given one, and I proved it without a shadow of a doubt. I only wish I could never tell my children about it. Confused yet? Let me shed some light on the subject. If you had asked me last week, I would have told you I was living a near-perfect life. A good job, a beautiful home, a loving and beautiful wife, and three of the most perfect children imaginable. The youngest of them was sitting in the back seat of my car as we took a leisurely drive to our favorite park. Sweet, innocent, little 9-month-old Cindy. 1-month-old Cindy. I always got a shiver when Cindy spoke. She was just learning, you know? Sure, I'd been through this twice before with her brother and sister, but as much as I love and enjoy my children, if it were up to me, Cindy would be the last. So the realization that this might be the last time I would experience the magic of all those first paternal steps gave an extra bittersweet tinge. Kindergarten, Daddy. That's right, sweetie. It's kindergarten. Whoa, what the? It was indeed a daycare center we had just driven past. But how the hell did Cindy know that? She was smart, but she certainly couldn't read yet. This mystery kept me occupied for the next 2 blocks, causing a horrible feeling of freezing. I'm a quick thinker, and if my friends are to be believed, have an uncanny ability to take in a bunch of facts and see all the possibilities very, very quickly. 2 blocks away, I saw only one possibility. Cindy had been to this daycare center enough times to recognize it. The problem was that my stay-at-home wife had never talked about putting Cindy in daycare. In fact, we agreed to wait until she was 2 years old. That was something I had to come to terms with. As soon as it was safe, I changed directions and parked in the parking lot adjacent to the center. Any parent will tell you how long it takes to get a toddler out of a car seat. And needless to say, I was no exception today. It didn't help that my mind was in turmoil the entire time. As I approached the door, I planned out how I was going to proceed. Hi, my name is Mike. Do you recognize this girl? I might have to explain. In the end, the decision was not in my favor when the young woman behind the front desk smiled as she looked at the roll-up in my hands. Hi, Cindy. What are you doing here on a Tuesday? You usually come in on Wednesdays, although I don't remember seeing you in our book for tomorrow. Hi, I'm Martha, and you must be Cindy's dad. Sarah has told us all about you. How I carried on a normal conversation with everything swirling around in my head is beyond me. I think I told her that Cindy saw the place when we were driving by and wanted to say hi to her friends. After a couple minutes of polite conversation, I bowed out and walked back to the car. As I drove Cindy home, further conversation was impossible. Sarah and I had been married for 10 years and were as solid a couple as any. The realization that she had been keeping at least one secret from me for some time now tried to seep into that statement, but I brushed it off. There had to be a legitimate reason for this secret. I just didn't know what one yet. As unpleasant as it was, I couldn't just ask her. Sarah was on her annual cruise with her favorite aunt and wasn't due out until Saturday at the earliest. Anyway, as I said, I'd married Sarah 12 years ago after a 2-year courtship. They talk about 2 peas in a pod. That was us. Soulmates in every sense of the word. Neither of us was overly ambitious, but we both knew what we wanted out of life, to see the world and have 2 children. And so, after 4 years of traveling and loving each other, she stopped taking the pill and a few months later we were pregnant. When we met, Sarah was working as a secretary for the owner of an electrical components company. Shortly after we were married, the economy tanked and she was asked to take an unpaid day off every Wednesday. That was fine with both of us. When James was born, our lives were turned around. Sarah happily became a stay-at-home mom, and I became the sole breadwinner. A designer working for a bunch of jerks who wouldn't recognize a good idea if it was shoved in their mouths. No, not anymore, Mike. One day you'll save enough money to go out on your own, and then you'll decide for yourself what you want to do. Sarah embraced motherhood like a ferret spotting a loose pant leg. We soon became the happiest bunch in the neighborhood. Well, outside of work, of course. When baby James was about 3 months old, we developed some minor health problems. It seems Sarah was having trouble producing milk. On the advice of the doctor and through a process of problem-solving together, we solved the problem by replenishing her milk supply with formula and giving her a day of forced rest. I arranged with Sarah's widowed mother to pick up Jamie from mid-morning on Wednesdays to give Sarah a chance to rest. Sarah either stayed home or went to adult classes. It was then that she returned to her childhood hobby of sewing. Soon after, she became even busier coordinating the design and construction of the house we commissioned. Sarah loved it, excited about the opportunity to let her creative side flow. She put off weaning baby Jamie completely until he was 2 years old. One or two hiccups delayed the completion of the house, but we were able to move in just in time for the arrival of our second child, Jenny. Yes, Jenny was born when James was just over 2.5. Life just kept getting better and better. The only time I didn't devote all my free time to the kids was when I was showing Sarah how much I still loved her. Jenny was another easy baby. We half expected milk supply problems and knew exactly what to do when they occurred. This time, Sarah weaned our little girl completely when she was about 18 months old. When I suggested surgery since we were supposed to have 2 children, Sarah surprised me by suggesting a third. I resisted, I have to tell you. We had a plan, and having another child would set it back. Eventually, Sarah convinced me with simple logic. If 2 perfect children are good, how would we be happy with 3? Cindy came into our perfect world 2 years and 6 months after Jenny. However, I don't want to paint a picture of absolute utopia. I had to work on getting my clothes to actually end up in the laundry basket, not just lying next to it. Sarah, not clogging the sink with my hair. Long hair is nice, of course, but I'm admittedly amazed at how much of it falls out every time Sarah brushes hers. We also have a constant battle with razors. She's constantly using mine on hers and dulling the blade. These are just some of the little annoying habits we've worked on to keep harmony. I once heard a statement that went something like this. Love in marriage is destroyed by little things like missing a cap of toothpaste because most couples have already dealt with serious issues like religion and politics before they bond. I believed in that statement, and so did Sarah, so we tried to keep minor irritants to a minimum. From time to time, Sarah and I had more serious arguments. The first non-serious argument happened when James was about 16 months old, over the stupidest thing. When I got home, I discovered that Sarah had used hair-tinting mousses to dye Jamie's hair red. She gave me the idiotic explanation that she wanted to celebrate her Irish heritage by dressing Jamie up as a leprechaun for St. Patrick's Day. I didn't object to the idea, but I didn't want her chemically altering our son's hair color. After a heated argument, during which I yelled at her for the first time, we agreed that in the future such things should be discussed and agreed upon in advance. Another incident occurred about a year ago, shortly after her mother's sudden death. Sarah suggested that Cindy go to daycare on Wednesdays so that she could have a day completely free of children. I strongly opposed the idea, unable to bear the thought of Cindy being cared for by strangers and upset about the separation. Besides, now that the older 2 went to school or daycare, Sarah only had to look after one of them for 6 hours a day. Like all good couples, we compromised. I would consider preschool when Cindy was 2 years old and emotionally strong enough for such activities. In addition, I offered to babysit one day each weekend so that Sarah could be free. I was relieved that she almost never took me up on my offer, because after working all week and all the chores around the house, I admittedly wanted to play with the kids rather than take care of them. Besides, her lack of requests proved, in my opinion, that she could live without interruption. Another source of irritation was Sarah's hints from Cindy's first birthday that she wouldn't mind having a 4th child. Odd, considering we had discussed this early in our marriage, deciding that we would aim for 2 and then move on to 3. For months, Sarah brought it up every chance she got. She was worse than a used car salesman. Funny how she couldn't make a convincing argument when I asked her why she had changed her mind so much. The conversation continued, but this time I intended to keep my opinion. Thankfully, over the past few weeks, she had toned it down. Hopefully, that meant I had dodged a bullet. I was one of 6 children, and my father died just after I, as the youngest, left home. The poor guy worked his whole life and never got to relax at the end of it. I didn't want him to suffer the same fate. And so, as we drove through a small shopping district not far from our house, I saw something that made me wince. It was the new electronic sign above the service station, brazenly informing anyone who didn't already know that today was Tuesday, May 1st, along with the time and temperature. Tuesday is today, tomorrow is Wednesday. Wednesdays. For the first 5 years of our marriage, Sarah worked every weekday except Wednesday. When James was a few months old, Sarah put her mother in charge of watching him. Wednesdays. This continued until her mother died last year. Now I learned that she put baby Cindy in daycare once a week. Yes, you guessed it, on Wednesday. As a result, my wife had about 6 free hours every Wednesday, and this went on for about 10 years. There had to be some simple, innocent reason for me to be deceived by a woman who, up until that point, I thought was completely incapable of guile. Something, some instinct, told me it wasn't just about a day off from motherhood. I cursed my intuition because there was now a huge and growing seed of doubt sprouting in my head, and I hated it. I wanted so badly to just pick up the phone and ask her what the reason was, to put my mind at rest, to burn the seedling growing inside me. But I couldn't. Sarah didn't get in touch until Saturday. Let me explain. Even before we were married, Sarah traveled once a year to visit her aunt who lived in England. Not that she went to England every time. Usually, and every time for at least the last 8 years, Sarah flew somewhere to join her on a cruise. The Mediterranean, the West Indies, Alaska. She'd been to all of them. I remember once asking her how much it cost, but she explained that her aunt was quite wealthy and paid for everything. Then I wondered if these annual trips were made to be on good terms with her aunt and increase her chances of inheriting. I immediately discarded that thought. Now, I wasn't so sure anymore. When the kids came along, she started juggling trips, freezing her decanted breast milk and leaving me fresh jars of formula. The timing of her recent weaning of Cindy was, in part, due to her current trip. I had never met this aunt, only talked to her on the phone a few times. Did I resent Sarah leaving the family for a week a year? Hell no. She deserved it. I took a week off and the kids and I had the time of our lives. Since I worked to live, not live to work, I spent that week in the role of father, driving the kids to school and cooking dinner. I loved it, so giving up one of my 4 weeks of annual vacation was not unusual for me. Plus, after she recovered from the inevitable jet lag, it was well worth the time spent, if you know what I mean. According to Sarah, they were now supposed to be sailing over Antarctica, where phones definitely don't work. Isn't that amazing? You catch a person in one lie, and everything they've ever told you falls under suspicion. How did I know she was on a cruise ship off the coast of Antarctica? Because when she came back, she showed us pictures and told us stories. It was undeniable, wasn't it? There was an easy way to find out. I remembered Sarah calling her aunt on the house phone a week ago. Digging into my memory, I found the English number. Without thinking, I pressed redial. It rang about 6 times before the time difference popped into my memory. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was about to hang up to minimize my highly antisocial behavior when suddenly the phone rang. Hello, you've reached The Simpsons. Pete and I are currently on a cruise off the coast of Antarctica. You'll be able to reach us on my cell phone starting on the 3rd of May. That was good, wasn't it? She was indeed on a cruise. The problem was that this newfound suspicious character was wondering who the hell Pete was and why no mention of Sarah. And of course, there was still the question of my aunt returning on the 3rd of the month and my wife only returning on the 6th. I wanted to stop that gnawing feeling inside me. Sarah and the kids were my life, but this secret was like an itch I just had to scratch. I couldn't leave it alone. I was desperately searching for answers. Photo albums. On the scrapbook shelf were individual little books with yearly photos from the cruise. I picked out last year's and opened it. There was a beach in Cancun. There was her aunt in front of a huge ship in Barbados. The aunt dining at an officer's table surrounded by dazzling white uniforms and gold braid. Flipping through each page, I didn't find what I was looking for. Looking for confirmation that Sarah's words were true, I picked up a second album, then a third, then a fourth. There wasn't a single picture in it that showed my wife. If I were a suspicious person, this would have struck me as very odd. Guess what? Why hadn't I realized this important fact before? Because I had never been suspicious before. Desperate to prove that my growing doubts were unfounded, I began looking for another way to prove that Sarah was innocent of all charges. Her car? No. For as long as I could remember, Sarah had always taken a late-night flight to wherever she was meeting her aunt. That meant catching a cab to the airport or, like this time, taking her car and leaving it at the airport in a long-term parking lot. I walked over to the filing cabinets and pulled out the folders containing Sarah's personal savings and credit card accounts. Luckily, each photo album had dates on it, which allowed me to find the weeks I needed pretty quickly. I knew from personal experience that in a long-term parking lot, you have to pay $85 for 7 days of parking. 10 minutes later, I found no such amount on any of the statements. Working backwards, I reached the fourth last trip before I noticed something else odd. In the 8 or 9 days of her absence, not a single solitary payment had appeared on any statement. I knew Auntie paid for everything, but not a single cup of coffee on the road? The suspicion was growing. I had to find out. By this time, Cindy was awake. I absent-mindedly called my sister and asked if she could watch her for a couple hours. As usual, she happily agreed. I dropped the chirping baby off, promising myself that she would never know that she had played an important role in the one time I doubted my wife. Hopefully, after today, I'll be able to scratch it out of my memory as a slightly embarrassing episode in a long and happy marriage. I headed to the airport. Luckily, we live in a small regional city. I parked in a short-term parking lot located between two long-term parking lots. Once, there were sheep pens here, but now cars were parked in rows for hundreds of meters. Choosing a direction at random, I began my walk. To make a long story short, after 45 minutes, I realized Sarah's car wasn't there. So where was it? On the way back, all sorts of plans swarmed in my head. Was I suspicious enough to contact a lawyer and confirm what I already suspected? Namely, that any divorce on any horizon would turn out to be my downfall. Since then, I've realized something. I'm probably the only citizen in my country, in case you were wondering, literary land, who doesn't have a lawyer friend. Bummer. Facts. I need more. And fast, before the sprout of doubt in my head grows big enough to tear through my scalp. Arriving home an hour before the kids had to be picked up from school, I did the only thing I could think of. I searched the house from top to bottom. For what purpose, I didn't know, but something might not have seemed right. Sarah liked the house. She had worked closely with the architect in designing it and then supervised the builders. Technically, the house was 3 stories. Built on a steep bank, the house entered on the main level where the kitchen, guest room, dining room, main living room, and 1 bath were located. Upstairs were the family room, 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. With this layout, there was still plenty of room under the house for Sarah's pantry and sewing room. These were accessed from the rest of the house by a steep and narrow staircase. Since the sewing room was the only room in the house that belonged exclusively to Sarah, it was the place to start. By the time I had to leave for school, I knew one thing. There was nothing suspicious in her sewing room. Everything in it was standard for a hobby room. I even checked the sewing table for hidden compartments, feeling a little silly. Leaving Sarah's sewing room, I glanced into the storage room that was accessed by a short hallway, but realized that my search would have to wait until the next day. I noted that the semi-basement room was dark, even in the early evening. I was distracted as I gathered my 3 treasures and prepared dinner for them. Not at all the same as usual. When everyone had gone to bed, I resurrected the old baby monitor, set it up in Cindy's room, and, bringing my mobile device with me, headed back to the lower level. In the pantry, I went through and opened all the boxes. Still nothing unusual or even remotely suspicious. Back upstairs, I checked on the kids, settled into my favorite chair, and sat up late into the night brooding. The next morning, driving the older ones to school and Cindy to daycare, I was still very unsatisfied. Yes, you heard right. Cindy seemed to like it and we hit the road. The other woman behind the counter was a little surprised to see us, but checked and said it was fine. Detective Mike's subtle questioning confirmed that Cindy usually gathered around 2:30 and had been attending daycare for the past 7 months. My rage at my wife's deception grew and grew. I wondered what excuse she would come up with if Cindy ever blabbed to me about daycare when I asked about her happiness. I sat in the car with my head on the steering wheel. What else could I do to make sense of Sarah's obvious deception? There was no way I could wait for Sarah to return so I could confront her face to face. The lack of answers was driving me crazy, and I couldn't wait that long. After searching the house, I found nothing, but maybe I was missing something. There had to be something that would explain everything. Making a decision, I hurried back into the house. Starting with the guest bedroom and then the master bedroom, I checked everything I could check, down to looking for hidden panels at the bottom of closets or drawers. Nothing. Alright. I fired up the home computer and went through all the directories. Again, nothing. Sarah didn't have access to my work laptop, so there was no point in checking it. Unless there was nothing in Sarah's car or on her phone that could be found. So what was the reason she was withholding daycare information from me? And where was her damn car? Where was my wife and what the hell was she doing on Wednesdays? Talk about something that annoyed me. It was still only 1 hour and 15, so I had time to start the only thing I could think about. Once down in the basement, I started over. I must have missed something. This time I actually moved the sewing table and looked for some unaccounted-for place to hide the compartment. Nothing. Then, I decided to take everything off the shelves and look inside, under and behind each item. Halfway through, I picked up one of those wheat bags. You know, the kind you stick pins and needles in. One of the needles stuck in my finger. Exhausted from lack of sleep, suspicious, worried, and very angry, I did something I've never done before. I lost my temper. Picking up a small, lumpy bag, I hurled it at the opposite wall. Or rather, aimed that way. At the last moment, it jerked in my hand and flew straight at the bare light bulb. There was a pop of an explosion, and I was suddenly in the dark. Frustrated at my loss of self-control, I sank into a chair by the desk, lit only by the dim light from the doorway. Because of the few windows on this level and the overcast day, the room was gloomy, so was my mood. I remained seated in Sarah's chair, partly to calm down, partly to think about where to look next, and partly to mentally transport myself into Sarah's mind for clues. At this rate, I was going to have a heart attack before she got home on Sunday. I fidgeted in my chair, going over ideas and possibilities in my tired brain. In my state of preoccupation, I slowly became aware of a thin ray of light. I actually only noticed it when I looked at my hand resting on the sewing table. It highlighted my wedding ring. Only later did I realize the irony. I followed the line of light on the wall of the scuffed wood-paneled room. I remembered Sarah saying she'd bought them cheap when we'd built the house. The cracked wood, I was assured, had defects, including holes from knots. From one such small hole, a light was shining through. It was about the size of a milk bottle cap and was just above and to the right of the sewing table. I put my eye up to it, but other than making sure there was an open space, I didn't see anything. As an experiment, I turned off the light switch near the main door. Sure enough, the light from the hole in the node disappeared as well. Running upstairs, I returned with a spare balloon and quickly installed it. The light filled the room again. For the next 10 minutes, I pressed, probed, moved, and pulled the wall looking for the secret door. Once again, all I got from my efforts was a feeling of extreme frustration. I was already thinking about getting tools to completely destroy the wall when suddenly a memory of one of my and Sarah's favorite movies came to mind. In the movie, a girl was walking around an old house trying to find the entrance to a secret passage. After sticking her finger through a tiny hole, she discovered that the door was open. My gaze turned to the opening. My feet headed toward it on their own. My pinky slipped through the hole and met the obstacle at the 3 o'clock mark. It did not move inward, outward, or counterclockwise. But as it moved clockwise, there was a distinct click, and one of the vertical wooden panels at the other end of the room opened an inch. My heartbeat sped up. Steady one moment, rapid the next. We built this house. The only people who might have known about this secret were the architect, the builders, and one other person, Sarah. Sarah, the only one who had the motivation to build the secret room. What was I was about to find out about my ingenuous wife? I knew instinctively that everything in the room was very important. The very attempt to keep me out of the construction site when this particular project was being erected spoke to that. Instead of the satisfaction of finally realizing that I hadn't lost my mind, that Sarah really did have a secret she was keeping from me, I gulped, pushing my sadness and frustration down where they could be dealt with later. Swinging the door open, I immediately found it pressed against the wall beam. That's why I hadn't felt any movement during my earlier probing. The space inside the door was illuminated by a light bulb above the frame. They say that keepers of secrets are often given away by the simplest things. Today, that saying was confirmed. Plugging that bulb and the sewing room light into the same switch was a mistake. Unless the light bulb outside burns out, or, as in this case, comes under friendly fire, the secret room will never be discovered. Strangely, I wondered if this was Sarah's oversight or if the electrician had failed to follow her instructions. I realized I was deluded. Knowing in my heart that whatever was in the compartment would forever change my happy life, I didn't want to reveal Sarah's secrets. For a long, drawn-out moment, I was tempted to close the room and leave. Perhaps ignorance was bliss. I realized later that even in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined the changes that awaited me in the future. The room was 24 inches deep. Behind a 3-foot wide panel, I could see clothes hanging on a steel bar like Sarah's closet upstairs. Unlike the latter, however, this one was more stylish and revealing than the ones I was used to seeing her in. Next to the drawers were hangers that held about 10 sets of high-heeled shoes. The right wall of the room was wood, and obviously an end wall. The left wall was steel. Turning to the left, I noticed that there was a gap between the wall and the steel wall. In the semi-darkness, I discerned that what I first mistook for a solid wall was actually the left door of the double set. There was a latch, which I activated to open the second door. The other half of the secret room was completely occupied by a huge fireproof safe. It was so large that it could only have been installed before the room was completed. Where was I when all this was happening? Sarah, oh Sarah, what are you hiding? The front of the safe had a keyhole and a big knob with spokes on it. Damn it, now I'm going to have to look for the damn key. In desperation, I grabbed the handle and leaned on it, nearly losing my balance from the unexpected turn. Sarah was apparently so sure I'd never find the secret compartment that she hadn't bothered to lock the safe. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Was she so sure because she thought I was a fool, or because she was so smart herself? If not for security, what was the purpose of this huge safe? To keep out mice? Or to protect the contents from fire in case the house burned down? Then the contents were very valuable indeed. Taking a deep breath, I opened the thick door and stepped into a completely different realm. The top 2/3 of the space was occupied by steel shelves. The bottom third was occupied by steel drawers. Oddly enough, the first thing that caught my eye was a glossy cruise company brochure. The cover depicted a cruise ship setting sail from an impressive ice shelf, Antarctica. There were others under this brochure: Alaska, the West Indies, and, you guessed it, all the other places she supposedly visited with her aunt. Even at this early stage of the investigation, I suspected this was her research material, the source of her future tales of fantastical, fictional cruises. One shelf held diaries, conveniently organized by year, and documents, some loose, others in envelopes. The next shelf held documents and several DVDs, all non-commercial and all in individual plastic covers. Each disc had initials and a date on it. The one on top was labeled AK August 4th, 2016. That was about 20 months ago. On the bottom shelf was an open wooden tray. When I pulled it out, the contents glistened in the light and glittered. There was jewelry haphazardly piled into it, lots of jewelry. Jewelry has never interested me, but I recognize 18-karat gold when I see it. They were clearly expensive pieces, but oddly enough, they looked like they'd been scattered randomly, almost thrown away. The owner, whoever he was, treated expensive trinkets with no respect. Among the shiny bling were 2 satin ring boxes. They, at least, looked as if they had been placed with care. The contents of the first, larger box left even me in awe. It was a single diamond, and a very large one at that. I held it up to my eyes, and from the way it sparkled at the slightest light, I knew it was the genuine article. The second box broke my heart. 2 rings looked small and insignificant against the rest of the hoard. One had a center diamond surrounded by 2 smaller diamonds, and the other was a simple gold bracelet. How insignificant these diamonds looked compared to the huge ones in the other box. How familiar those rings were. Of course, they were familiar, because I had bought them. One was given to me when I was on my knees. The other when I was standing in front of the priest. I fell to my knees in a sick parody of my proposal, my hands shaking like a Parkinson's sufferer. Wherever my wife was, which wasn't far from home, she was there as a single woman. The barriers that had prevented my thoughts of extremes collapsed under this latest evidence. I am a little ashamed to confess that I rose to my feet only to stagger back to my chair and collapse into such an emotional state for some time. I was only interrupted by the alarm clock on my phone reminding me that it was time to run to school. I pulled myself together, shared my shock and grief, and left. This time, I picked up James and Jenny first, and then drove to my sister Carrie's house. We were invited to dinner. All the way there, I pondered what I had found and what it meant. After dinner, while my kids were playing with their cousins, I told my sister and brother-in-law all about it. They couldn't believe that Sarah was not only a loving wife and caring mother, but that she wanted to go to my house immediately and see what was in the envelopes, papers, and diaries. We all knew that if we were destined to learn the truth before Sarah returned, it would only be from these documents. Sis wanted to come home with me right away, but I waved her off, telling her that I needed to deal with all of this first. Once that became polite, I got the kids home and put them to bed. Grabbing the baby monitor after Cindy dropped the kids off, I went back into the house, excited and yet somehow reluctant to start reading. Before picking up the first magazine, I decided to read them first. I pushed the wooden tray back on the shelf. This drew my attention to the one place I still hadn't explored, the steel drawer at the very bottom. It stood at an awkward angle and I couldn't budge it. I lowered myself to the floor and took a closer look. There was no locking mechanism. Grasping it firmly, now at a more comfortable angle, I pulled harder. It slipped out. I leaned back on my heels, stunned. The reason it had been so difficult to open was that its contents were very heavy. But gold is gold, after all. On a thick felt mat lay 11 gold bars. A few were small 100-gram bars, but most were large 250-gram bars. I didn't know much about bullion bars. Right after the wedding, Sarah convinced me to buy a 100-gram bar as an investment. It was still stored in a safety deposit box in the bank. Her boss was convinced that gold was about to skyrocket. He was right. The bullion we had paid about $7,500 for was now worth over $14,500. It seemed like not a week went by without Sarah Googling the current price of gold and letting me know how much our shiny little brick was worth. I did the math in my mind and figured the box held about $133,000 worth of bullion. While I was trying to figure this out, I noticed that the layer of felt under the ingot was lumpy. Lifting a corner of the mat, I saw another layer of ingots. Hastily removing a few of them from the front, I lifted another layer of felt and discovered another amazing layer of gold. Was this really how Howard Carter felt when he opened Tutankhamun's tomb? Another hurried shifting of the ingots revealed that the third layer was the last. Hurriedly but carefully, I emptied the drawer and stacked all the bricks according to size. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the calculator app. I won't bore you with the calculations, but even assuming the current price is around $1,800 per ounce, there was over $1.5 million worth of gold in the box. It was only then that I wondered, where the hell did Sarah get it from? A horrible thought crept into my soul. Putting the bricks back in the box, I tried desperately to come up with a rational explanation for everything I'd discovered. Except for the most obvious one. I hesitated a bit about which document to read first. In the end, I decided that diaries offered the best chance of quickly figuring out what the hell was going on, so I picked up the one labeled 2018 and opened it. I was wrong. It wasn't a journal. It was a ledger. Not only that, it was coded. No, I quickly realized, not code, just shorthand. The first page began with a balance sheet, carried over, presumably from late last year. Oddly, it wasn't just in dollars, but ounces in dollars. In the far right column was written the dollar amount, $1,657,900. I realized that this was the only way to account for fluctuations in the price of gold. On the first page, the gold amount was unchanged and the cash on hand for the last Wednesday in January was up $1,500. I flipped to February. Cash receipts of $1,500 each occurred on 3 Wednesdays. January was a school vacation, and we went on tour for 3 weeks, returning only for a few days to prepare for the kids' return to school the first week of February. Oh no. In March, there were 3 deposits of $1,500 each. In April, there were 3 deposits for what I was beginning to think of as a standard amount, and one for the impressive sum of $20,000. Oddly enough, the next day, there was a withdrawal for the same amount. I quickly looked through the rest of the book, but it was empty. Inside the back cover were 3 printed A4 sheets. A quick glance at them showed that they listed houses or something similar for sale. I had much more important things to do, so I only glanced at them briefly. Then I picked up last year's magazine. This time, I only glanced through it cursorily, pausing when I finally saw something in the debit column. To be exact, 2 debits in 1 month. The first amount was $78.53 and was labeled Troll. All I could think of was that it meant gasoline. Fuel for her car? How odd if that's exactly what she meant. The second debit was labeled VS $125 Ling. What the hell that meant, I didn't know. The invoices were also pasted into this log. It took a few minutes to make sure they were receipts for bullion payments. On the same page as the journal, the cash amount was decreasing and the ounces were increasing. Most months there were 3 cash receipts, some months there were 4. In the summer months it sometimes came to 1 or 2. Out of interest I flipped through March of last year. 2 receipts for $1,500 and 1 for $20,000. Next to the latter was written, West Indies. You guessed it, that was the destination of last year's cruise. A quick look at the ledger for 2016 revealed a $20,000 credit next to the word Greece, the intended destination that year. I glanced at the stack of brochures. Sarah had returned that year with vivid stories and even some Greek. If she really had never been there, the level of dishonesty was staggering and heartbreaking. Who was this woman? Did I even know her at all? I forced myself not to think about it. I wanted to be as clear as possible. I set aside last year's diary and, instead of flipping through them all, picked up the earliest one. It was labeled 2003, the year before we met. A quick glance showed that there were many more entries per month, but usually for smaller amounts. The very first loan was for $200, but that number grew to $600 in the first 3 pages. Next to each loan were initials. I think there were about 4 or 5 different initials. Scanning the rest of the book, I found 3 larger amounts, all for $10,000. All of them confused me, so I moved on from them to the envelopes. The first was a regular business-sized one. The envelope might have been ordinary, but its contents became increasingly strange. It contained the registration papers for a Ferrari automobile. The car's owner's name was Sarah, and it had first been registered just under 2 years ago. Sarah owned a car that was probably worth at least $500,000. Where the hell was she located? A memory flashed through her mind, involuntarily brought to the forefront of her mind. I think it was last year. I was driving to work on business when I stopped at a stoplight next to a gleaming red Ferrari convertible. I looked back to admire it. Behind the wheel was a blonde-haired woman wearing sunglasses and a headscarf. She looked to be about my age, but I didn't look closely. I was interested in the car. Next to her, with his hand on her bare leg, sat an older guy who seemed vaguely familiar. The words "sugar daddy" came to mind. I was admiring the long, sleek front of the car when I noticed with my peripheral vision that the driver was looking at me. I turned to smirk, but she quickly averted her gaze. Perhaps her sugar daddy was the type with possessive tendencies. Again, with my peripheral vision, I saw the light turn green. I expected the Ferrari to rush past me, but it stayed behind me until it turned 2 blocks later. Maybe Sarah was driving it? There certainly wasn't a car worth several $100,000 in our driveway. I'm observant and would almost certainly have noticed her. So where was she keeping it? What a depressing life it must be. To own one of the best cars in the world and not be able to drive it every time you want to. Maybe just once a week on Wednesday. But how do you make sure she's not recognized by her acquaintances? Perhaps by wearing a blonde wig, a headscarf, and huge sunglasses. The next envelope was big and pudgy. It contained cash, lots of cash. That didn't interest me in the least. Strangely, underneath the envelope was a brochure advertising the apartment. I knew the place. The first phase of the complex had opened with great pomp a couple months ago. Sarah and I had talked about it. The Riverview apartments weren't selling like hotcakes because of the price. It hasn't changed much from $750,000. One of the things I love. Screw it. At this point, I had to give her credit. Unlike lawyers whose motto is, every man is innocent until proven broke, I am a firm believer in the old maxim, every man or woman is innocent until proven guilty. Where was I? I liked the fact that Sarah wasn't looking to advance her career. She seemed quite happy with the small 6-figure salary I was bringing home. Eventually, we could afford one of those apartments if she worked. However, that would have meant giving up her primary role as a full-time mom. Neither of us were ready for that, so I could understand that Sarah had the brochure, but why was it hidden here? As I stepped back to the closet, away from the best light in the sewing room, I noticed a folded piece of paper had fallen to the floor. It was a blank title deed to an address in an apartment complex. Sarah's maiden name was written in ink in the appropriate box. At the bottom, where the franking stamp should have been, was a crude sketch of her. Whoever had drawn it had no artistic ability whatsoever. Next to it, in the same font as her name was written, "You know what you have to do to get the real thing." Perhaps Sarah did know. I was puzzled, however. The next, much thinner envelope contained a simple one-page appraisal of what I assume was a large diamond ring. It was appraised by a firm from a neighboring large city. I picked up the box containing the large ring and looked inside again. Holy crap. So this is what a 5-carat diamond looks like for $132,000. I guessed it was a real diamond when I first laid eyes on it, but the fact that it could be worth that much blew my mind. I put the ring and papers back where they belonged. Eventually, I looked at the appraisal again. July 2014. Jenny was only a few months old at the time. Did that period have any significance? As far as I could tell, none. Moving a stack of desk calendars to the back of one of the shelves, I found 2 boxes of morning after pills. The calendars themselves were labeled Sarah's Cycle. Hurrying to look at the rest of the papers, I didn't ponder their meaning for long. The remaining papers consisted of envelopes labeled by year, which upon closer inspection turned out to be receipts. I glanced at one. Victoria's Secret. Upstairs, we had a similar hoard of receipts. Sarah had saved them all in case she had to return something. All that was left were the DVDs. Subconsciously, I knew they would end any hope of Sarah's innocence that I had left. There were 6 of them. 3 were labeled with different initials and dated shortly after our engagement. The other 3 were labeled with the letters AK. One was taken 3 months before we were married. The second was 7 years later. And the last one, as mentioned, just under 2 years ago. I looked at the DVDs, then at my watch. Time to make a decision. I was already exhausted from one sleepless night and suspected that what was on the videos would rob me of many more. In the next year or two, I had responsibilities after all. I had 3 kids to take care of. So, after texting my sister to ask if she could watch Cindy the next day, I went to bed. If Sarah's only crime was depriving me of this family time, she had already committed a serious offense. The details of how I drove the 2 older kids to school and dropped off Cindy are irrelevant. Suffice it to say that at 5 minutes past 9 on Thursday morning, I was in the living room loading the first DVD into our turntable. Returning to the family room with the case in hand and my heart already pounding, I reread the label. SJ September 20th, 2005. I had proposed to Sarah in September of that year. Was it significant? I didn't know. Further reflection was interrupted by Sarah's voice coming from the television. I turned and collapsed onto the couch, my worst fears realized. I stared at the screen, shaking my head. It was Sarah. And yet it wasn't her. Her demeanor, her choice of words, even her mannerisms. This was not the Sarah I had known and loved for so many years. Hearing the man, whose name turned out to be Steve, excusing himself, I took the opportunity to look around. It looked like a hotel room with a small kitchenette. Behind Sarah's back, in the corner of the room, was a small table set up as if for dinner. The guy had clearly made an effort to make the furnishings resemble his home. Sarah, speaking directly into the camera, completed my introduction to the room. Sarah's speech shook me to my core. Suddenly, the purpose of the video became clear. This was not a keepsake. It was a tool, and more so for financial gain. I hit the pause button and rushed to her sewing room, grabbing my journal for 2005. For every month up to and including September, the diary showed a contribution with the initials SJ. For the rest of the year, nothing. No major unexplained deposits either. I checked 2006 too, but SSJ seems to have disappeared. If she was blackmailing Steve, where the hell was the trail? She kept records of all deposits and withdrawals, so why would she treat blackmail any differently? Still pondering this conundrum, I went back upstairs and started getting ready for the show. I stood pondering the movie as it suddenly switched to Sarah speaking directly into the camera, now fully clothed. "Hi, Steve. I thought I'd give you a little souvenir of our last time together. I'm sure you'll agree with me. It was unforgettable. Yeah, you heard me right. Our last time together. My situation has changed, and while it was fun, it's time to move on. This little video will never see the light of day unless you're a good boy and contact me again. If you see me in public, you won't acknowledge me. If someone introduces us, you'll pretend it's the first time. And you will never, and I mean never, tell anyone about me or talk about our time together. If it comes to my attention that you told anyone anything about me, your sweet little Josie will get a copy of the videotape. And we wouldn't want that, would we, Stevie? In that brief moment when the screen went black after her words, Sarah smiled understandingly. It wasn't a very pleasant smile, and certainly not the happy and loving one I was used to seeing on her face. I felt sick and depressed, lower than a mosquito in my stomach. I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to eat again, but at least the mystery of why was solved. The video wasn't blackmail, it was insurance. After hitting the play button, I decided that I didn't have to watch every moment, just familiarize myself with the broader story. It turned out that RG was a wealthy married CEO named Richard. Each clip ended with Sarah's now familiar warning. It was clear to me, at least, that in preparing for our upcoming wedding, she was distancing herself from her past. I paused before turning on the first of AK's videos, dated June 2006. Based on Sarah's notes, Alaska was a regular customer of hers. Why? What made him different from the others? Why 3 videos? Did she genuinely love him? Or maybe she loved him? I knew the only way to get answers to my questions was to watch the first of his videos, but I still hesitated. They can't be any worse than the ones you've already seen, I told myself. Get it over with. AK stood for Artie. He sounded familiar to me. I stopped the movie at the opening scene, a close-up of Artie's face, studying him. Where had I seen him before? The answer eluded me until I hit the play button, and Artyom turned around. His profile gave him away. It was a guy in a Ferrari driven by a blonde woman. A blonde who, as it turned out, was Sarah in a wig. The first video confirmed the validity of my theory about the extent of the pain. But I recognized the bedroom in our first house. How could she? How could she bring him into our house? I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I was procrastinating, and I knew it. Unable to procrastinate any longer, I went back into the living room. DVD-2 was calling to me. I couldn't help but notice the date, August 2013. And why such a long break between movies? So many questions, so few answers. As I returned all 6 horror movies to the hidden closet, a certainty crystallized in my shocked mind. I had married an alien. If it weren't for all the evidence I now possessed, I would never in a million years have believed that my wife was capable of what the movies told me. In a trance-like state, I went to get the kids. Again, my sister invited us over for dinner. While the children played, I recounted in abbreviated whispers everything I now knew. The picture was not a pleasant one. Sure, I had missed the movies and hadn't studied the ledgers properly, but the conclusion was the same. I had married a very smart, very talented actress who, when I met her, was a prostitute. At first, she charged a modest amount. Without knowing how long her sessions lasted, it was impossible to judge how modest. Gradually, she raised the fee to what she thought she deserved. I could only guess. It was like buying art. It all depended on how much one was willing to pay. Sarah looked the way she looked. Imagine Kate Beckinsale and you'd realize she was willing to indulge them. And you could tell that men were willing to pay pennies for her services. After we met and I, for one, fell madly in love, she began to gradually get rid of clients. Clients who I suspected belonged to the city's elite. They had to be so to afford to pay for the services of a woman like Sarah. A beautiful, discreet woman who indulged them all. Abandoned them all? Sadly, no. Whoever AK was, he had survived. Judging by the gifts he'd bought her, probably because he was so generous. If she sold the Ferrari, the diamond ring, and the bullion, she had a good life. My sister asked the question I'd been avoiding. What do I do with all this? Divorce because of blatant dishonesty and turn into a closeted whore? That was my reflex. Anger at Sarah's betrayal, at her long and ongoing deception, crowded out other emotions. I suppose they would show up later. In a way, I didn't want the intensity of my anger to diminish. Feeling out of control with rage was better than a broken heart. After discussing the current divorce laws with my sister, I came to a grim conclusion. Sarah would most likely hide her stash and have a huge nest egg in reserve. In doing so, she would live in my house, have custody of my children, and live off my child support while probably continuing to slap around a skinny old sugar daddy. The possibility of being separated from my kids was too disgusting to contemplate. I had to figure out how to avoid it. That became the only unchallenged platform of my planned response. If it meant I was still going to live with that slut, then so be it. It was Carrie who brought me back down to earth. I assumed I would have a say in my future. But what if I didn't? What was Sarah's game plan? With her assets and no doubt connections, would I even have a say in my future? What was Sarah's game plan? The latest video of her ex-pregnant fetishist boyfriend made me think that at least part of her loved me. Was I part of her future, in a good way? Or was it just as I had envisioned? Was Sarah loving and evil? Did my future depend on which one was dominant? Once again, my little sister questioned my assumptions. What if Sarah didn't have the resources? In today's society, doesn't fortune favor those with fortune? Come to think of it, wasn't that always the case? Then, as now, the golden rule of the 21st century is that whoever has the gold makes the rules. So, after dinner, I accepted my sister's kind offer to stay the night with me and the kids, to unload me and help me read the ledgers more thoroughly. After the kids fell asleep, we discussed what I had been pondering in the car on the way here. Do I need to call her aunt in England to confirm that Sarah never spent a single week of the year at her place? Eventually, we came to the conclusion that no. If my hunch is correct, Sarah called her aunt between the end of the cruise and my loving wife's return home. Sarah stocked up on photos and compelling stories before returning home. Whether her aunt knew about her game or not didn't matter. Sarah had been warned that she was coming home with a fight, and I wanted to catch her off guard. I wanted her to be as stunned by her discovery as I was. Having made her decision, Sis started reading. The goal? To make an educated guess as to whether I was part of Sarah's future plans. 2 hours later, Sis woke up and there was no gold, no jewelry, including Sarah's rings, no Ferrari license or cash in the safe. They were in waterproof hiking tubs buried under the compost pile. I checked them in daylight to make sure my camouflage efforts were convincing. I had resources now. I could only hope that if it came to a fight, they would offset Sarah's legal advantages. If it came to that, of course. My plans were still fluid. And I joined my sister, and together we finished scanning the ledgers. The conclusion? My view of the situation was confirmed. Sarah had several clients before our engagement and only one after the wedding. The records for earlier periods allowed us to match the initials of some of the clients to movies. From her little speeches at the end of each video except the last, we realized that Sarah had anticipated problems with some clients leaving. Pretty clever, really, to record a session to then blackmail them into leaving gracefully and discourage them from contacting her if they saw her with their happy family. I didn't recognize any of the locations from the first 3 discs. Perhaps she didn't want a reveal to specific clients where she lived. On the other hand, all 3 AK movies were in our house. Sarah was smart. I couldn't assume that she would set up regular meetings with him there. There was too great a chance that one of the neighbors would mention it or I would come home unexpectedly. By the 3rd AK movie, it was clear that the guy enjoyed humiliating me. I imagined him pressuring Sarah to have their sessions in my bed. How often did she succumb to that pressure? I could only guess that AK knew where she lived, so there was no reason to hide it. Besides, setting up a blackmail camera was much easier in her own home. Having only retained one client, probably due to his generosity since there was no video evidence that she loved him and, if the latest video was to be believed, possibly repulsed him, Sarah continued to lead a secret life until now. The length of her deception and betrayal was astounding. It got to the point where she was charging $1,500 a pop every Wednesday. More accurately, every Wednesday except for school and family holidays, or presumably when the lover was away or Sarah was on her period. The latter explained why there were only 3 sessions most months. Once a year, we guessed, she would pretend to spend a week with her aunt and either stay at his house or actually go somewhere with him. Either way, it was costing him $20,000. The ledgers neatly recorded his payments. Particularly noted were the dates he gave her a large cash bonus of $100,000 a month after Jamie was born and a large ring right after Jenny was born. then the Ferrari when she was pregnant with Cindy. Both assessments were carefully analyzed. They showed withdrawals from the lingerie register. Suddenly, the abbreviation I read on one of them made sense. VS stood for Victoria's Secret, and Ling stood for underwear. Whether Sarah had invested in lingerie to interest her lover or just for herself, it was impossible to say. After all, they had been having fun for over a decade. Every few pages there were receipts that Sarah had turned cash into gold. Small amounts, below the limit that would interest anyone looking for clues to organized crime. I would have found her intelligence and planning skills impressive if they hadn't been overshadowed by her skill at deception. There were only a few entries that we couldn't explain. The largest one was made just last month. It was a $20,000 write-off that followed almost immediately after a $20,000 payment from AK, and the comments column simply had the initials HM. Did she buy something? Was she being blackmailed? There was nothing in the papers or ledgers to explain this debit. Strange, and as I pondered this, I noticed Carrie scanning the pictures of the children on the wall of the family room and then looking at me. In response to my question, she brought up an issue that I had been thinking about since I watched the first AK movie, namely the paternity of my children. She even went to the sideboard, pulled out an old family photo album of us as kids, and spent 10 minutes comparing the coloring, facial features, and other characteristics of us at similar ages, and I was pleased that she saw the same family resemblance that I did. It was reassuring because I knew I couldn't be sure I wasn't just seeing what I wanted to see. Suddenly, the significance of the morning after pill and the fact that Sarah was monitoring her cycle came to my attention. Thank goodness. Sarah seemed to be doing the right thing, at least in that regard. But still, accidents happen. I decided that despite the family resemblance or not, we should order DNA and STD tests. With our investigation stalled, we devised a plan. Wait until Sarah got home and confront her face to face. What else could we do? It was Thursday evening, and Sarah wasn't due back until Sunday night. I was already planning to take Monday off. My sister had agreed to watch the kids on Sunday and take them to school on Monday. The rest was up to the gods. Before I went to bed, I showed Carrie some excerpts from one of AK's videos. My sister also seemed vaguely familiar with the guy, but she couldn't give me his name. What I did the rest of the week, I no longer remember. Thank God for the kids and their routines. Thank God for their needs and constant questions. They were my anchor. Loving them made it hard to contain my anger because just as my children were a part of me, they were also a part of Sarah. I couldn't get enough of anger. Anger helped make it easier to bear what was happening. I was distracted and increasingly nervous, but at the same time, I was determined to wait until Sunday. The expected call from Sarah on Saturday that she was back in range never came. After picking up the kids on Sunday, I sat back and mentally prepared myself for the upcoming confrontation. The details of my contingency plan became unimportant. Sarah didn't show up, nor did she show up on Monday, not a word. Now, extremely angry, I was experiencing the accompanying emotion of anxiety. Never having waited for a word or a better idea, I filed a missing persons report late Monday night. I stuck to the facts as stated by Sarah and did not hint at what I knew about her other life. I realized from their responses that they thought she was just another runaway wife. I was literally told, "Don't call us, we will call you ourselves." I tried my best to hide my concern from the children, just making meaningless statements that she was delayed. I took the rest of the week off. On Wednesday, I was brought out of my reverie by the squeal of brakes on the road. Looking out the window, I saw my sister running toward the front door waving a newspaper. She calmed down enough to show me page 5. The first one read, "Local millionaire to open new women's hospital with bathtub announced." The article went on to say that he had donated funds to build the orphanage, but that information barely penetrated my brain. I couldn't see beyond the pictures. Arthur Kindred, AK. He looked about the same as he did in Sarah's last video, except he was dressed. Standing sullenly beside him was his wife. At first glance, she seemed much younger than her husband, even despite the sour expression on her face. She was the epitome of the stereotype of the bored, rich wife. Hair and makeup applied to the point of shine. On closer inspection, the age difference didn't appear to be that great. She'd simply slowed down the aging process with a scalpel and maybe a couple of injections. She was a beauty, or at least she had been when she was younger. Now she resembled a wilted rose trying to regain the first flower of her youth. Arthur Kindred was rich. I mean very rich. And he was also known for avoiding publicity unless there was something he wanted to get his hands on. Not surprisingly, he was known to me, but kept off my radar. That explained the Ferrari, too. Anything under $1 million was nothing to this guy. He never even showed up once when he donated his Gulfstream 550 every year on the day of the Joyride Fair. Excitement swept over me. Now I had a name. Now I could get an address. And then reality hit me. Sure, I now had a name, but because of that name I was faced with a dilemma. This man could be a key source of information about my wife's whereabouts. The only problem was that I couldn't use that information without telling the police much more than I wanted them to know. If Sarah was the victim of foul play, I would automatically become the #1 suspect if I revealed what I knew about her lover. In the end, I decided the only way out was to check it out for myself. After saying goodbye to my sister and putting Cindy in the car, I drove to Arthur Kindred's house. Kindred's house turned out to be a mansion the size of a small state, kept behind locked gates. I parked on the other side of the road, pondering if I could look inside the compound from some vantage point. No. As I pondered my next move, a silver Lexus pulled up to the open gate. Mrs. Kindred got out of the driver's seat to check the mailbox. I recognized her by her sleek, artfully dyed blonde hair. Cindy, who was sitting in the back seat, spoke clearly. "Aunt Jean." Once again, blind rage almost consumed me. This creep's wife knew my daughter. My whore wife must have brought Cindy here. Where would Sarah's betrayal end? How goddamn sick were these people? Was it really possible to stoop to such lowliness? Starting the engine, I crossed the road and stopped behind the Lexus. Mrs. Kindred blushed, but she stayed on her feet. I swung the door open and without waiting for it to open fully, shouted, "Will you please explain how my girl knows who you are?" I watched as she looked toward my car. Cindy, in her innocence, waved her hand slightly. I watched the remnants of color fade from Mrs. Kindred's face as she, stammering, replied, "I had nothing to do with that. You'll have to ask my husband." She turned and headed back to the driver's side of her car. "Is he here?" I shouted. "No, he left this morning. He'll be back this weekend. Now get out or I'll call the police." With those words and a strange look on her face, she drove through the gate which closed behind her. Her facial expression puzzled me. What was it? Was it just discomfort, panic, anger, irritation? None of the adjectives fit. Jean Kindred knew more about Sarah's whereabouts than she was telling me. Of that I was sure, but with no way to meet her or her husband in a place where they couldn't dodge me and no better plan, I headed home. Cindy confirmed that she had been to the big house many times. I hoped like hell she hadn't visited her father there. I stopped by the store and bought DNA test kits. The kids could be like me and Carrie, but I was at the point where I needed something definitive, something solid that I could believe in, because it was clear from everything I'd discovered that almost nothing in my life was as I'd imagined it to be. To make a long story short, I didn't go back to the mansion that weekend. It was all over the news that night. The private jet of Arthur Kindred, a local philanthropist and just a good guy, had crashed in a neighboring state. There were no survivors. How disappointing is all this? When am I going to get a break? How do I find out what the hell is going on with Sarah? My only hope was to corner Jean Kindred. 2 bodies were recovered from the rubble, both male. This was a surprise. I half expected to hear that one of them was a woman. Relief, anger, fear, and frustration stirred restlessly in my stomach. It was horrible to wish your wife was alive and well and dead at the same time. The bodies were presumed to be those of Arthur Kindred and his pilot until the crash victims were identified. The plane was headed for Brisbane and then refueled and set a course for Mexico, where Mr. Kindred was known to have a business. No one was more surprised than I was when a silver Lexus pulled up to my driveway on Saturday morning. Why would Arthur Kindred's widow come to see me now when she'd avoided me in every way possible before? I watched her approach and, without turning my head, asked my sister to take the kids to play in the backyard. Carrie didn't even bother to ask why, just gathered the kids up and ushered them out the back door. The sound of the door closing matched the ringing of the front doorbell. With each step toward the door, a new possibility popped into my head. She had come to tell me where Sarah was, that Sarah had met her maker. Perhaps she wanted to find out how much I knew. By my silence? I wasn't sure how I felt about any of those possibilities. Mrs. Kindred, to what do I owe this honor? Mike, I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound so presumptuous, but I never knew Sarah's last name. Do you mind if I come in? I need to discuss a few things with you. In response, I stepped aside, giving her room to pass. She did, her heels clicking on the polished floorboards. She stopped in the doorway, waiting for me to direct her. I gestured to the left into the living room. Make yourself at home. Can I get you something to drink? A glass of water, please. I poured myself one while I was at it. Handing her the glass, I sat down across from her. She took a sip, set the glass carefully on the coffee table, and squared her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she met my gaze. There was determination and something else in his gaze that, again, I couldn't quite grasp. I suppose you're wondering why I'm here. You said you had something to discuss with me. She smiled awkwardly. Yes. I waited, keeping my gaze on her. She cleared her throat, then laughed nervously. If you had told me when I was a newlywed that one day I'd be sitting in someone's living room, talking to you like I am now, I would have called you crazy. I smiled. It didn't reach my eyes, but I figured a show of friendliness would help her get to the point. May I assume from your visit earlier in the week that you are aware of the relationship between Arthur and your wife? I nodded, not wanting to reveal the extent of my awareness. I was more interested in how deep her awareness was. Did you kill my husband? The direct question shocked me, and my mouth dropped open. I recovered, but anger made my answer harsh. Listen, lady, your husband was killed in a plane crash. Yes and no? I raised an eyebrow, determined to control my answers. Yes, the plane crashed, but it wasn't caused by mechanical failure or pilot error. They found bomb residue. Don't ask me how I know that. It's unofficial information. He was killed. I kept my reactions under control this time. It was difficult. Murder? I felt like my life was spiraling out of control. Panic fought with outrage. Outrage won out. So what does this have to do with me? Well, you could say that finding out that your wife had a long-term affair with my husband could serve to destroy you. The same could be said for you. Crime of passion and all that. Add to that what you are to inherit, and I'd say you're probably suspect number one. I wonder if the purpose of your visit and your question is to distract me from these thoughts, to keep me from going to the police with a theory like that. She pressed her lips together. I've known about Arthur and Sarah for years. Why would I kill him now? Maybe you finally had enough. Maybe they did something that was the real straw for you. Maybe you found out he was going to divorce you. Maybe you were biding your time. Maybe you decided you suddenly had a fall guy. Me. I don't know. You tell me. Jean Kindred snorted in a rather unladylike manner, but beneath her bravado I caught a note of concern. It's all nonsense. As I said, young man, I've known about this for years, and you, on the other hand, have only recently learned about it, if my assumptions are correct, which I think they are. The police may consider it a coincidence that Arthur died within 24 hours of you showing up at my house looking for him. They may also find it interesting that you condoned your husband paying a prostitute. Don't be so naive. Many rich men have mistresses and their wives turn a blind eye. I looked at her with contempt. I'm sorry, I forgot. You're rich. The usual rules don't apply. She had the decency to flinch. And that's why you destroyed it? For the last time, I did not kill your husband. Did you? She sighed impatiently, but there was a note of displeasure in her voice again. As I've already made clear, I had no reason to. I've known about this couple for a long time, and why would I come here and ask if you destroyed Arthur if I am guilty? I noticed she didn't answer with a simple no. Well, as they say, the best defense is offense. That's not going to get you anywhere, Mike. Well, I'm not going to confess to a crime I didn't commit just to suit your interests. What do you know? Why should I tell you? She growled again in frustration. It occurred to me that she was a woman used to being obeyed, and I wasn't doing as I was told. I needed to get information from her without revealing what I already knew. How? How to accomplish that? Okay, Mrs. Kindred, tell me what you know about my wife and your husband, and I'll tell you if I already knew this fragment. She stared at me intently, weighing me. Finally, she sighed and nodded. Deal. I was surprised she agreed but didn't argue. She took a sip of water and cleared her throat. Sarah had some kind of financial crisis in college. To get out of it, she took up prostitution. One day she told me she liked it, said it made her feel strong. She also liked the money. Arthur started using Sarah's services in 2003. She waited, raising an eyebrow. The college financial crisis was news to me, but I nodded anyway. I know. Sarah tried to end their relationship in 2006, but Arthur convinced her to continue. I know. I wasn't sure about that, but it made sense given the date of the first video. The second video was filmed when Sarah was pregnant with Jenny, so maybe Sarah was thinking about ending the relationship after giving birth when we had two planned children. Apparently, after the second video was filmed, she changed her mind about something since we had Cindy, and she even talked about having a fourth child. I didn't speak my thoughts out loud. Jean Kindred wasn't supposed to know them. Arthur couldn't have children, so he was somewhat obsessed with it. Over time, he encouraged Sarah to become pregnant. He rewarded her with a substantial amount of money when she gave birth to Jamie. I flinched at her mentioning Jamie's name, but nodded. I couldn't help but ask the obvious question. If Arthur was so obsessed with becoming a father, why didn't you try IVF or adopt when you found out he couldn't have children? Arthur was a proud and vain man. He denied that our inability to have children stemmed from him. Jean Kindred looked away, clearly feeling uncomfortable, but straightening her spine, she continued. I wasn't sure I could stay married to him, so I went along with his denial. Honestly, if it hadn't been for Sarah, I probably would have left. Thank you. I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. Glad my wife can be useful in helping you maintain your lifestyle. Jean Kindred shuddered. I saw a blush come up to her throat. Her embarrassed look gave me a brief but fierce thrill of joy. Arthur, she continued, encouraged Sarah to have another pregnancy, and when she gave birth to Jenny, gave her a diamond ring. I was prepared for her to find out about Jenny and managed to restrain the natural urge to shudder. At the same time, I almost admired Sarah's maneuvers. She'd lured Arthur out of a perfectly good diamond ring to do what she was going to do anyway. I nodded, and Jean Kindred continued. So I suppose you were against having more children, but I think Sarah might be as persuasive as Arthur because you went ahead and had Cindy. Fury boiled in my stomach, bitterness burning my throat. Yes, she could be the same, and let me guess, Arthur gave her a Ferrari? It was Mrs. Kindred's turn to nod. I fought the urge to punch something. The rage at the realization that I now had 3 beautiful children because a dirty old man had paid my wife to have them was beyond me. Children were supposed to be conceived for love, not greed. I know Arthur offered to buy her an apartment if she could convince you to let her have another child. I turned away to hide my anger. I know. Then you know everything. Not really. I don't know why you're so, how can I put this? Understanding? Compliant? Mr. Mike, I didn't like that. In fact, I rather resented it. It was humiliating, but it relieved me of the burden of meeting some of Arthur's needs, and so I tolerated it. So you sold yourself for a life of comfort and privilege. She lifted her chin and looked at me, but didn't protest. That surprised me. Why wasn't she defending herself? So, Mike, it looks like we've reached an impasse. I think you killed Arthur. You think I did it. We both had motivation. Either way, being investigated is bad for both of us. So is the publicity. Think of your children. Wow, you're a real grieving widow, aren't you? Arthur killed all my love for him years ago, but that doesn't mean I killed him. It also doesn't mean I shouldn't get what's due me for his death. I nodded. In a way, I couldn't fault her logic. She probably deserved her inheritance tenfold. I'll tell you where I am, Jean. May I call you Jean? Jean nodded. Jean, I will keep my mouth shut with the press under 2 conditions. 1, you won't mention me to the police to divert attention away from yourself. If you're as innocent as you say you are, you can clear your name easily. Come to think of it, even if you are guilty of murder, and I think you are, you have the means to avoid prosecution. And 2, if you tell me what you know about Sarah's disappearance. After another hard look from Jean, she began, Arthur left with Sarah for Mexico on the Lear and returned alone. When I asked him where Sarah was, he said he left her there in a brothel for a week. What? I whispered, jumping to my feet. It's true. He said he did it because she was trying to break up their relationship by blackmailing him with videos. Besides, he's been wanting her to tell you everything for a long time, and finally to get her to have another baby. He was just flying to Mexico to pick her up when his plane was shot down. What? To get me into this? Why? He obviously doesn't know me very well. What's stopping me from going to the press and exposing him? Well, that was the answer to why Sarah needed a picture of us in the guest room. I can easily imagine Arthur Kindred pressuring Sarah to do it in our marital bed, and since it was our dream home, she probably resisted, and they compromised by putting my or our picture in the spare room. The why has two aspects, I think. He always said that after the first 50 million or so, money loses its meaning. Next, it's all about power. What could be more powerful than using your influence to entertain a guy's wife in front of him, knowing he's powerless to do anything about it? As for how to ensure your silence, he figured that by offering you $1 million, he could buy him and your consent to a fourth child. So like most men who are driven by money, he figured it would induce me as well. Yes, he thought everyone had a price. Apparently my wife has one, I muttered angrily, and then frowned, unhappy that I had displayed my rage in front of someone like Jean Kindred. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. Then why did he go to extreme measures when she tried to cancel on him? With his wealth, why didn't he just offer Sarah more money or toys, or find another woman? Jean looked away, clearly mulling over her answer. I realized she had made her decision when she sighed submissively. As much as I hate to admit it, he loved her in an unhealthy way, to say the least. And a new woman would mean starting a relationship from scratch, and the new girl might not be as reserved as Sarah. A new woman would be too dangerous to his reputation as a philanthropist. Arthur decided that scaring Sarah by leaving her in Mexico would be the best option. I collapsed into the chair. This was too much. I don't know what I suspected, but not this. This was too far-fetched, too surreal. Mexico? It was such a cliché, like something out of a movie. Don't look at me like that. They had orders not to touch her or let her touch them. She was there to find out what awaited her if she didn't play ball. My husband can be very ruthless sometimes. Remember our deal, Mike. No press. All I could do was nod. Words failed me. Okay, I'll see myself out. At every click of Jean Kindred's heels, I flinched. They were like nails in a coffin. My coffin. Before her visit, I was hurt, confused, angry, frustrated, and upset. Now I was in purgatory. Jean Kindred confirmed all my suspicions, confirmed my worst fears. And at the sound of the front door closing, I hung my head. My fate was sealed. I would never be able to unravel Sarah's deception, her long list of lies. Never again would I be able to live in blissful ignorance of her constant betrayal. Never again will I be able to believe that she loves me with all her soul. Never again will I be able to tell myself that she was mine, as I was hers from the first kiss. Never again will I be able to be sure that she is in my corner and has my back. Always, from this day forward, I will have doubts. For the rest of my life, I will have questions. Everything. Every moment spent together, every conversation, every whispered word of love, every promise. How much of it was real? How much was Sarah playing a role? I'll never know, and it broke my heart as much as her betrayal. Hearing the children's gasping laughter, I lifted my head. No matter how I felt, they needed me. For their sake, I had to stay strong. My grief had to wait. I pulled my neck from side to side to relieve the tension that stiffened it and tried to focus my thoughts. Why had Jean Kindred seen fit to talk to me? If she really did think I was guilty of murder, she'd decided to take a chance on me tying up loose ends, so to speak. And if, as I suspected, she had orchestrated her husband's murder, she risked being seen visiting a man who had reported his own wife missing. A wife bound to her dead husband. Had I thwarted her perfect murder by unexpectedly bumping into her earlier in the week? Was she really that worried about bad press? Did she really have something to hide other than a simple murder? And Sarah? What the hell am I supposed to do with her? How do I get her out of Mexico when I don't even know what brothel Arthur Kindred left her in? And even assuming I managed to get her back to Australia, where the hell do I go from here? An insidious thought crept into my tortured mind. I tried to fight it, but its tendrils were like smoke, pervasive, infectious, all-pervasive. No, I told myself. No, it's not you, Mike. But it still persisted. Had I wanted to rescue Sarah from that brothel? No sooner had I gotten rid of that abnormal thought than my sister and the kids burst into the house. By unspoken agreement, we put off discussing Jean Kindred's visit and rushed to bathe the children and prepare dinner. Jean's words echoed in my brain, intertwined with memories of Sarah. Unpleasant words and tainted memories. I hated it when they distracted and interfered with my time with the kids. God, I thought Cindy would never settle down, Carrie complained, settling back in her chair and tucking her legs under her. So what did the deceased's widow say? I don't even know where to start, I began, holding out her wine glass. From the beginning, Mike. Tell me word for word what she's said, and then we'll take it apart piece by piece together. I recounted the entire conversation as best I could, only when I got to the part about Sarah's whereabouts. Carrie's sigh said it all. Jean assured me they have orders not to send her to work, but still, what are you going to do? Do you know? How to rescue people from Mexican brothels? I don't know for all three questions. Okay, let's work out a rescue plan. When Sarah gets back to Australian soil, what do you plan to do? I don't know, Carrie sighed. There's a lot you don't know, Mike. You're going to have to start making decisions. You have to have a plan of action. I know, but I still can't reconcile all of this. I can't reconcile the Sarah of the Ledgers and the Ferrari with the Sarah I've loved for 12 years. One moment I see Sarah in yoga pants making pancakes on a Sunday morning, and then I have a vision of her, studded with diamonds, in one of those deep cleavage dresses that hang in the secret room, and I have a hard time believing it's the same person. No, that's understandable. Her double life threw me into a stupor too. Carrie paused, taking a sip of wine. How about we go back to basics and weigh the pros and cons? I nodded. What else was I supposed to do? And so we laid everything out, and eventually the list of divorce supporters started to look a little sick. Sure, there were a few major items on it, trust and betrayal, but I had to admit that pride and ego were making their presence felt too. There were many material points on the side of the divorce opponents, such as losing 60% of my assets, paying alimony, child support, having to live in an apartment in a shoebox, but all of that paled in comparison to the emotional points. How could I reconcile being a father working weekends? How could I accept not seeing my children every day? I loved reading them stories. I loved putting them to bed, loved having them snuggled so snugly against each other, smelling of soap and innocence. Even if I revealed Sarah's secret life of prostitution to the court, there was a good chance they would still award her custody. I can't believe what I'm about to say, but just spit it out, sis. Have you thought about not saving Sarah? What? I stared at Carrie like she'd grown a second head. She was usually the epitome of kindness. I couldn't believe she'd voiced my previous thought. Is it any worse than what she's been doing to you since the very first date? She cheated on you from the very beginning. She lied to you every day you knew her. As I understand divorce law, if she doesn't come back after 2 years, you can have the marriage annulled, or even divorced on grounds of abandonment. That way you won't lose everything you were working towards, and you won't lose time with the kids. Is leaving her in Mexico so much worse than what she did to you all those years ago? You could always ask Jean Kindred to see to it that Sarah is not harmed. Would that be harder on the kids than a divorce? I sipped my wine, running Carrie's words through my head. Even knowing the depth and scope of Sarah's subterfuge and betrayal, for all the reasonableness of Carrie's words, could I do this to Sarah? Would I have been able to leave her in Mexico? I turned my head to the side and looked at the clock radio. The display glowed a ghostly green light. 12:27 a.m. I sighed and rolled over onto my back, turning away from the agonizing numbers. There was no way sleep was coming. Carrie's words echoed in my head. She cheated on you from the beginning. Did you ever think about not saving Sarah? Would that have been harder on the kids than a divorce? Sarah hurt me the worst. She dealt such a blow to my heart that I wasn't sure I would ever fully recover. She made me doubt every moment we had spent together over the past 12 years. The Sarah from the secret room was a stranger to me, but that Sarah who cried tears of happiness in my arms when our children were born, I loved. I loved her with all my heart. But why? Why did she carry on after we were engaged? I could understand that she was using her assets, so to speak, to get out of a financial crisis. I could disagree with her method, but I could understand. But after our engagement, after the wedding, that was something I would never understand. Images of Sarah from our life together turned into images of her driving a Ferrari in a blonde wig. I saw her in her favorite white sundress and then in one of the expensive dresses from the secret room. Which Sarah was the real Sarah? How could I have known? How could I believe everything she told me? How could I know when she was sincere and when she was playing a role? Of one thing I was sure. Whatever had driven her to have our children, she loved them. She couldn't pretend, not knowing who my wife was, what her intentions were, how I and my children fit into this situation gnawed at me. I had to know. There had to be some way to find out. Something was holding me back. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but I knew. Whatever it was, it had to be found in the secret room. Without thinking, I sat down and lowered my feet to the cool floor. With baby monitor in hand, I headed for Sarah's sewing room. I pounced on the envelopes and loose papers first. I didn't know exactly what I needed, but again, I believed I'd know it when I saw it. Then I moved on to the ledgers, grabbing the very last one. As I rushed to open it, the scattered papers from the back fell to the floor. I was about to ignore them, but instinct made me look down. From the page popped the words, Sale. Design for life. Downtown graphic design. Studio looking for a new owner. My brain turned on, calculating the situation. She was going to use at least some of her ill-gotten wealth to buy me my own design studio. She was continuing to sell herself for us, for me. I might not like or agree with what she was doing, but she was doing it for her family. I fell to my knees. Unshed tears stood in my eyes. I really did have a place in Sarah's future. She really did love me. A rush of love mixed with relief coursed through my veins. Jean Kindred's words echoed in my head. He did it because she was trying to end their relationship by blackmailing him. Sarah was trying to end it. She must have decided she'd earned enough for us. How she was going to explain to me where she got the money from remained a mystery. Maybe an inheritance from her aunt or a lottery win? Whatever it was, she wanted out. Whether our marriage would survive was still very much in question. How would I get the images of her with certain clients out of my head? How would I be able to trust her again, knowing her acting ability? She had managed to deceive me for so long, but even though she had hurt me deeply, she didn't deserve the fate that had befallen her now. I had to save her. I had to free her from the brothel. I prayed that Jean Kindred would find out which one Arthur had left Sarah in. In the case of Shaw v. Shaw, I rule in favor of Mr. Shaw and award a dissolution of marriage for abandonment. Mr. Michael Shaw retains custody of the 3 children as well as 100% of the property acquired during the marriage. The rest of the judge's words fell silent. The case was over. I was no longer married to Sarah. I was a free man. I wasn't overwhelmed with a sense of victory or pleasure, only sadness. I looked over my shoulder at Carrie. She smiled encouragingly. When the kids were safely in bed, I poured myself a port and sat on the veranda. It was a beautiful night, but I hardly noticed anything, immersed in the past. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, and the same questions I'd been asking myself for the past 2 years kept running through my mind. Was I doing the right thing? Did I have a choice? What kind of life had I condemned Sarah to? I shuddered, remembering that night. The night I had an epiphany about Sarah's motives. I went to bed relieved, but I was awakened by the torchlight shining in my face. I mentally replayed the scene. In the torchlight, I could make out a man dressed in black, a balaclava hiding his features, sitting on the edge of my bed. He pointed a gun at me. I stared through the silencer at the tips of the bullets clutched in the casings. "Hello, Mr. Shaw. Nice place you got here." The incongruity of his words and the gun in his hand made me stare at him dumbfounded. I was certain that Jean Kindred had decided to take me out of the equation, just like Sarah and her husband. That knowledge almost made me shit my pants, deciding that I was in for a horrible end. My first thought was of my children, and without hesitation I pleaded for them to be spared. "Please don't kill my children. They don't know anything. They are innocent in all of this." I'm not here to kill you or your children, at least not yet, Mr. Shaw. Or may I call you Mike? I nodded, slowly and carefully lowering myself into the chair. I was confused. Why was he here if not to kill me? So Mike, tell me, where's your hot wifey? She and I had an appointment today that she unfortunately missed. I really hope she's not trying to get out of our deal. I stared at him dumbly. He raised an eyebrow, imperceptibly changing the angle of the gun. I don't know where Sarah is. She's been missing for over a week. You can go to the police. I filed a report. That's not good news, Mike. You see, Sarah was supposed to pay me the rest of my debt today. What are we going to do about it? What? I shook my head confused. Sarah owes you money. How much? For what? Even as I asked the questions, my brain began to connect the dots. We had a business arrangement, half up front, half upon completion of the job. Well, let's just say the work is done. A business arrangement? What work? Mike, 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 the man read. If Sarah wanted you to know the details, she'd tell you. All you need to know is that I owe $20,000. Tell that to the landlady. I'll be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock to collect the debt. But I don't know where Sarah is. I can't give her anything. Then you'll have to lay out the money for her. Repeat after me, Mike. 20000 V 14 o'clock. I did as I was told. He nonchalantly headed for the door as if he had all the time in the world. It didn't even occur to me to attack him as he stood with his back to me. Something told me this guy could handle himself. On unsteady legs, I made my way to the family room. I tried to comprehend his words, but my mind rebelled. I forced it to think. Suddenly, the unrecorded $20,000 entry in Sarah's ledger made sense. Half before the job, half after. The job was done. HM stood for hitman, and he was going to get his money. The job was to kill a man. Kill Arthur Kindred. Get rid of the man's problem like a used tea bag. I felt sick. Suddenly, all the inexplicable expressions I'd seen on Jean Kindred's face made sense. Confusion and fear, a strange mixture. No wonder I couldn't understand them at that moment. I was cruelly mistaken. It wasn't Jean Kindred who had set up her husband's murder. It had been Sarah. I shook my head again and again, unwilling to believe the obvious, despite everything Sarah had done, all her lies, her deceit, her betrayal. I found it hard to believe she was capable of murder. But she was capable. This man's words cursed her. We had a business relationship. All you need to know is that I owe 20 grand. Half up front, half on completion. 20 grand at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What would drive a man to murder? I can understand any parent protecting their partner or child, but to take the life of another human being for no reason? What kind of person is capable of that? Sarah had known Arthur Kindred for over a decade, and by all accounts, he was generous to her. So why wish him dead? There was only one conclusion to be drawn from Jean Kindred's words. This was the second time Sarah had tried to end their relationship, and Arthur was clearly not going to go quietly. Sarah wanted to leave, and Arthur wouldn't let her go. Does that justify her organizing an assassination attempt on him? No, in my opinion, no. He posed no physical threat to me or the children, only to Sarah, who was keeping her secret. She destroyed this man to keep the truth from coming out. It was truly horrible. Was she really capable of treating me with the same cold, hard logic? The night passed without sleep. The next morning, I took the kids to their schools and Cindy to Carrie's. I didn't say anything to Carrie about what had happened. There was plenty of time for that later. Using the money from the secret room, I prepared an envelope for the hitman. The situation was ironic from many angles. Arthur Kindred had essentially paid for his own murder by paying the ultimate price for Sarah's kidnapping. And Sarah? She was locked up in a brothel at the time because the hitman she hired killed Arthur when he was about to release her. She's responsible for her own imprisonment, not me, not Arthur. It was her own fault. At exactly 2, the doorbell rang. Hey, Mike. Knowing the purpose of this guy standing at my door and what his profession was, his excessive friendliness became ominous. The envelope was in my hand, but I didn't immediately hold it out to him. With a pounding heart, I asked the question that had kept me awake all night. How do I know that after I pay you what Sarah owes you, you won't come back for more? His fake smile was replaced with surprise and then resentment. I'm a professional, Mike. Sarah and I had a business arrangement, and once you hand over that envelope, our business with each other will be complete. I nodded and handed him the money, praying I wasn't mistaken. After all, how reliable are the words of a man living outside the law? I watched him walk away. Maybe I imagined it, or maybe I knew what he did for a living, but everything about him radiated danger. His words from the night before echoed. Oh, and Mike, good guys, real sweethearts. I made some inquiries about them before I woke you up for our little chat. Something told me that for the right price, he'd destroy anyone. And Sarah brought him into our lives, our children's lives, our sweet, innocent children. That knowledge made all her other transgressions seem like a drop in the ocean. As horrible as the years of her lies had been, as painful as the realization of her betrayal had been, they paled in comparison to the fact that she had risked the well-being, the very lives of our children. It was unforgivable. In that moment, I realized that the decision had been made for me. One of my most important responsibilities as a father was to protect my children. The horror lay in the realization that I had to protect them from their own mother. Sarah had committed a crime that, had she been caught and tried by a jury, would have gotten her a life sentence. Coincidentally, she ended up in a Mexican brothel where she probably would have spent just as much time. Karma had definitely bitten her in the ass. Taking a deep breath, I brought myself back to the present and took a sip of port. I love my children immensely and would do anything to protect them. That meant it would take me a while to fully come to terms with the decision to leave Sarah in Mexico. That was the price I had to pay for what I had to do as a father. Epilogue. Jean Kindred. Jean couldn't miss investigating her husband's murder. The police were meticulous, to say the least. Although she was innocent and no charges had been brought against her, enough dirt had been slung at her that her former friends had ostracized her and excluded her from the society for which she had sacrificed so much. Jean never married. With no children, grandchildren, or true friends, she was unable to enjoy her extraordinary wealth and died a lonely woman. She kept her word and never mentioned Mike to the police. Apparently, she feared notoriety more than a police investigation. After a 2-year investigation, the police concluded that Arthur Kindred was murdered by the Mexican Cortez cartel for opening a shelter for battered wives and unborn mothers, where many wives of lower-ranking cartel members escaped. Mike Shaw. Mike sold the house he shared with Sarah. The couple who bought it were thrilled to have a secret room. Mike did his best to show them both the opening mechanism. Mike bought a new house, closer to his sister Carrie, with a detached 4-car garage and an apartment above it, which he converted into his graphic design business. Using some of the $1.6 million from Sarah's secret income, he was able to find time to build his business from the ground up, as well as hire a full-time housekeeper, nanny, for James, Jenny, and Cindy. Over time, Mrs. Knowles became a pseudo-grandmother to the children. 5 years after Sarah's disappearance, he met Diane, a young single mom. Their relationship didn't take hold immediately, as each had a lot of baggage, but through perseverance, they finally found love, peace, and lasting happiness with each other. Ironically, Mike ended up having 4 children. Diane's son, Ryan, who was a year younger than Mike's son, Jamie, ended up falling in love with Cindy when he returned from college to find her all grown up. But that's another story, and DNA tests proved that Mike is the biological father of all 3 of his children. HM Hitman. True to his word, HM turned out to be a professional and never bothered Mike and his family again. During one of his visits to Mexico, he came across a familiar face. Sarah Shaw. It took some time, but Sarah finally got used to the Mexican climate. By the time she retired at the age of 50, she had earned 23 million Mexican pesos for her employers, which, at the exchange rate of the time, quite coincidentally equaled 1.6 million Australian dollars. By the time she retired, Sarah had long forgotten her real identity. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.